Hello and welcome back to another video. This one has breaking news coming from Syria, the Syrian civil war, which has entered a new active phase with the new rebel offensives taking place in the northwestern parts of the country. The Syrians have launched a massive assault on Hama, which is one of the largest cities within Syria. The Syrian army, the government forces, built up a large contingent of troops in Hama to face the rebel forces and launch a counter-offensive towards Idlib to regain some of the territories lost and to push the rebel forces back. Instead, the rebel forces continued their offensive operations day after day, getting closer and closer towards the city, and today they have managed to capture the city itself. The Syrian government forces wanted to fight ahead of the city, in front of the city, using the city itself as a supply hub. However, before they were ready, before they managed to build up enough forces and establish a front line, the Syrian rebel forces continued to push and managed to push them out of the city as the Syrian government forces decided to withdraw out of the city and abandon it, claiming they wanted to avoid urban warfare and to save the civilians from harm. The rebel forces have fully adapted to modern warfare. They have adapted drone strikes and they are making full use of drone capabilities, the whole range of it, to gain an advantage on the battlefield, both in terms of reconnaissance, in terms of drone strikes, and so on. One example of these is the amount of drone strikes we see, such as this one here, where we see a drone targeting a tank in the countryside somewhere in Hama. Then there's this additional strike on a building which contains government forces underneath it. Then there's this one where an additional armored vehicle was spotted and then an FPV drone struck it. Many of the tanks that we see never see combat because they're simply struck by the drones, following which the rebel forces manage to capture these vehicles and make use of them themselves. We get an example of such an operation with this video here. Again, the rebel forces are using drones for reconnaissance, detecting troop movement of government forces, and once they are exposed out in the open, they drive through with their own vehicles, which they have captured from the government forces, driving multiple tanks and infantry fighting vehicles up towards these forces, forcing them to withdraw and escape because they cannot fight a vehicle. They drive with high speed, try to ram the infantry and shoot after their positions. The government forces have yet to establish defensive positions and deploy ATGMs, and they're not running around with RPGs, which are all mistakes, which we have seen plenty of in the Russo-Ukrainian war. Here we see that the rebel forces simply completely overwhelm the government forces, and they just cannot cope with the benefits that the rebel forces are gaining through the use of these drones, giving them full reconnaissance and a lot of information that they then can use to completely gain the upper hand in this conflict. Therefore, we can conclude that the rebel capture of Hama is the natural course of events, considering the lack of adaptation from the government forces. The government forces are not using drones, they don't have drone operators, and they aren't getting a proper picture of the battlefield as the rebel forces have. And when you have such an information advantage, there is simply not much you can do against such a force as the rebel forces, who have completely adapted to modern warfare. The capture of Hama was then followed very quickly with the withdrawal from the Syrian Arab army, and due to the quick withdrawal, they yet again left additional equipment along the front line, some of which is from the Hama military airport, where we get this video here from rebels driving through the airport, where there are several aircraft which were abandoned by the government forces. This means that the government forces cannot use these jets anymore, yet the rebel forces can not either since they do not have any pilots. But with this, the rebel forces now have fewer bombs to worry about. And at the same time, we also see towards the end these tanks that they have captured, how they are now using them themselves. As they capture more and more military bases and cities, the rebel forces will become stronger as they capture more and more equipment, slowly transitioning from Toyota pickup trucks to T-55s, T-72s, and T-90s. And this brings us to the next city, because the rebel offensive does not stop here. They have simply not taken enough casualties due to the lack of fighting from the government side. And this means that the battle will now move on from the city of Hama, which was recently captured, to the city of Homs. This will lead to a cut-off from the Syrian land border between Damascus in the south and Tartus, as well as Latakia in the coastal areas of Syria. They would have to then move through Lebanon, which would actually be a possibility. Which is why if the rebel forces want to cut off the connection completely, they would have to move to Tartus. And in this scenario, the Russian Navy is actually stationed in this city of Tartus. And that means that they would be in direct confrontation with the Russians if they were to move towards that city. The alternative is to move directly towards Damascus following Homs, which would lead to a direct fight between the government forces and the rebel forces, and there would be nowhere left for the government forces to withdraw to, because the final cities south of Damascus are all mostly Sunni cities, which supports the opposition mostly and are in opposition to the government, such as Daraa, which is a million city, which is completely opposed to the government and has been so since the start of the civil war and prior to it. As for the battle over Homs itself, the government forces have withdrawn from Hama to their defensive line, which is most likely this line here, which is the river line connected from Hama and then down towards the south of Homs to Khotina Lake in the south. So this river line here moves through the south of Hama and all the way down towards Homs. It is likely that the government forces will establish a front line along the river line, which will force the rebel forces to either go directly towards Tartus in the west or to move along the eastern bank of the river line down towards Homs. Directly crossing over would be extremely difficult as it is a wide river with a few bridges, and if the government forces establish a defensive line alongside it, it'll be very difficult for the rebel forces to break through. Therefore, it is most likely going to be following one of these two roads, either to the east towards Salamiyah and then down south towards Homs, or directly to the west towards Tartus and Latakia. It is very likely that the rebel forces will prioritize fighting in the direction of Homs rather than the coastal areas to avoid an escalation in terms of the Russian forces, because the Russians have a lot more to offer. They simply are not prioritizing the current situation in Syria over the war in Ukraine. However, if their naval base in the Mediterranean Sea is in danger, that may change, because it is instrumental for the Russian global presence for them to have some sort of ports they can access to, avoiding the Turkish canals in and out of the Black Sea. Right now, the Russians are dependent on Turkey to exit or enter the Black Sea. Losing the port in Syria, that means that they would have no presence in the Mediterranean Sea, and the only presence would be in the Black Sea south of Russia, as well as the Caspian Sea, which is landlocked from all sides. Therefore, the port is extremely important in Syria. The rebel forces are already attempting to reach out to Russia and negotiate some sort of settlement with them, either letting them keep the ports or military presence within Syria, for them to simply stop supporting the current Syrian government In either case, Russia has so far expressed complete support for the current government in Syria and have sent hundreds of airstrikes on rebel positions since the start of the offensive just over a week ago. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.